For more than 2 decades, the NASCAR world has carried a wound that never fully healed. The tragic death of Dale Earnhardt at the 2001 Daytona 500 didn't just change the sport, it shattered millions of fans and forever altered the lives of everyone who was part of that fateful race. But no one carried the weight more heavily than Sterling Marlin, the driver who was directly involved in the final seconds before the crash. For years, he stayed silent, choosing dignity over drama and respect over speculation. But now, at 67, Sterling Marlin has finally decided to break that silence. And what he reveals is something no one expected. He begins by acknowledging a truth he has lived with quietly for decades: the constant blame, the hate mail, the emotional burden of being linked to a legend's death. But Sterling reveals something far deeper: details about that final lap that he has kept buried out of respect for Dale, his family, and the sport that raised them both. For the first time, he opens up not just about what happened on the track, but what happened inside his heart in the moments afterward. Moments he has replayed 1,000 times. And in this rare, emotional confession, Sterling tells the part of the story he never shared publicly: the conversations he remembers with Dale in the days leading up to the race, the warning signs he now realizes were there, and the quiet guilt he carried even though investigators cleared him completely. What he reveals isn't scandal, it's humanity, it's grief. It's the truth of a man who never wanted to be the villain in a tragedy he couldn't control. This is Sterling Marlin. Let the world has never heard him before. Raw, honest, and finally ready to say what he has held inside for long years. For Sterling Marlin, the roar of engines and the high-speed blur of the racetrack had always been home. He grew up in the world of NASCAR, raised on asphalt, adrenaline, and an unspoken brotherhood among drivers who understood the risks better than anyone. But none of that could prepare him for the moment that would define the rest of his life. And as Sterling turned 67, he finally admitted something he had never said publicly before. The weight of Dale Earnhardt's death never left his shoulders, not for a single day. On February 18, 2001, Sterling was just doing what he had done hundreds of times before: racing hard, racing smart, and fighting for every inch of track. He had no idea that those final seconds on the last lap of the Daytona 500 would follow him for decades, overshadowing victories, drowning out celebrations, and haunting him in ways fans never saw. While the world replayed the crash again and again, pointing fingers and drawing conclusions, Sterling lived a quieter, more painful reality, one where he blamed himself long before anyone else ever did. In this chapter, Sterling reveals that he felt the pressure of public judgment almost immediately. Even before official investigations cleared him, he sensed the storm brewing. Cameras zoomed in on the moment of impact, rumors spread, talk shows debated, and although he knew he hadn't done anything reckless, the image of Dale's black, no, 3-car shooting up the track after their contact became a loop he couldn't escape. But what the world never knew until now was the emotional aftermath Sterling endured behind closed doors. He describes going home after the race, sitting at his kitchen table long after midnight, unable to sleep, staring at the wall as guilt gnawed at him. His wife tried to comfort him, but Sterling couldn't shake the feeling that he had been part of something unforgivable. Even though the truth was far more complicated. As the days passed, he avoided interviews, avoided turning on the television, avoided anything that forced him to relive the moment. Friends reminded him that Dale was a seasoned driver who had survived crashes far worse. Crew members told him repeatedly that he had done nothing wrong. Yet Sterling reveals that none of it mattered. The guilt came from inside, not outside. What made it worse was the silence. NASCAR was shaken, teams were reeling, and the entire sport seemed frozen in grief. But Sterling felt alone in that grief, alone with questions he had no answers for, and emotions he didn't know how to process. He remembers walking into the garage the week after the accident and feeling every eye on him, even though no one said a word. He recalls fans glaring at him, some refusing to make eye contact, others whispering as he walked by. And then came the letters. Some were kind, expressing sympathy for what he must be going through, but others were filled with anger, blame, and cruel accusations. Sterling kept them anyway, not to punish himself, but because he believed he deserved to bear the weight of people's grief. Even now, at 67, he admits he still has a box full of those letters tucked away in a closet he rarely opens. But as he begins telling his story, Sterling makes one thing clear. This chapter isn't about clearing his name. It's about finally acknowledging the truth he never had the courage to say aloud. That the tragedy didn't just take Dale Earnhardt's life. It changed Sterling Marlin's forever. The final lap of the 2001 Daytona 500 has been replayed millions of times, slowed down, analyzed, dissected by experts, fans, and critics. But for Sterling Marlin, that moment is not a clip, it's a memory he can never turn off. And at 67, he finally reveals what he actually saw, what he felt, and what he most regrets about those final seconds. Before tragedy struck, Sterling remembers it vividly. The intensity of the closing laps, the tension in the air, and the feeling that the entire field was driving on instinct. Everyone wanted position. Everyone wanted one last shot. And Dale Earnhardt, the Intimidator, was doing what he always did best: blocking, defending, and racing with fearless precision. Sterling insists he wasn't trying to cause trouble. He wasn't trying to force a move. He was simply trying to get to the front like every other driver. "We were all fighting," he says. "That's racing. That's how it works." Dale knew that better than anybody. As the cars barreled into Turn 3, Sterling saw an opening, a small chance to move forward on the inside. He went for it cleanly, legally, and without aggression. But Dale, trying to protect his position for his two teammates ahead of him, made a defensive move that brought their cars closer than anyone expected. That's when their fenders touched just enough to unsettle Dale's car. Sterling's voice shakes as he recalls that split second. "It wasn't a hit," he says softly. "It was barely a tap, the kind of thing that happens 100 times in a race. But this time, everything went wrong. Dale's car shot up the track toward the wall." Sterling remembers instinctively lifting off the gas, thinking Dale would catch it because Dale always caught it. He was the master of controlling chaos. He had saved cars from far worse, but this time, he didn't. The Black No. 3 slammed into the wall at an angle that still gives Sterling nightmares: fast, sharp, violent. Even from his seat, Sterling sensed it wasn't normal. The moment the safety crews rushed toward Dale's car, Sterling felt something inside him collapse. He pulled into pit road, shaking. His crew crowded around him, trying to read his face. "Is he okay?" Sterling asked repeatedly. "He's okay, right?" No one knew. No one wanted to guess. Sterling stayed in his hauler for nearly an hour after the race, waiting, praying, hoping. Every minute felt like an eternity. And then the news broke. Dale Earnhardt was gone. Sterling remembers the silence, the suffocating, unbearable silence, as though the world itself had stopped spinning. He remembers sitting down on the steps of his hauler, head in his hands, trying to breathe. His crew didn't know what to say. No one did. What Sterling reveals now, after 24 years, is that he replayed that moment in his mind over and over, desperately searching for something he could have done differently. A millisecond faster, a millisecond slower, a slightly different angle, anything. But every official investigation came back with the same conclusion. Sterling had done nothing wrong. Still, he didn't believe it. Not then, not for years. "People think the crash was the worst part," he says quietly. "It wasn't. The worst part was knowing I'd been part of Dale's last moment, and not being able to change it." This chapter ends with Sterling admitting something he never told anyone. On the night of the crash, he didn't sleep at all. He sat alone in the dark, haunted by the final lap that stole a legend and left him carrying a burden he never asked for, but could never put down. In the days following Dale Earnhardt's death, the world of NASCAR was drowning in grief. Fans were devastated, teams were shaken, and the media was desperate for answers. But in the middle of that storm stood one man who felt every spotlight, pointed directly at him: Sterling Marlin. And in Chapter 3, he finally reveals how the blame, the backlash, and the silence that followed almost broke him completely. Sterling didn't want to leave his house. The weight was too heavy, the guilt too sharp. He felt like everywhere he went, he carried a shadow he didn't deserve but couldn't escape. Even though NASCAR had made no statements yet, even though there were no official findings. The public had already begun forming its own opinions, and Sterling could feel it, in the way people stared, in the way conversations fell silent when he walked by, in the way reporters hovered like vultures outside his garage and home. The phone rang non-stop, friends checking on him, reporters demanding answers, and fans leaving messages that ranged from heartbreaking to hateful. Sterling describes standing by the phone one afternoon, listening to a voicemail that made his stomach drop. A fan screamed, cried, and accused him of killing a hero. Sterling deleted the message, but the words stayed with him for years. Others sent letters filled with anger, disbelief, and grief that Sterling understood all too well, because he was grieving too. But the hardest part wasn't the blame from strangers. It was the silence from within himself. He didn't know how to process the emotions. He didn't know how to defend himself without sounding like he was arguing against a tragedy no one wanted to relive. So he said nothing. He stayed out of sight, hoping the world would calm down, hoping the pain would begin to fade. It didn't, at least. Not at first, when NASCAR officials finally spoke, and later, when the full investigation concluded Sterling was completely cleared. The crash, they said, was not caused by recklessness, aggression, or malice. It was a combination of speed, angle, and bad luck. Nothing more. But even with the truth out there, Sterling still felt the sting of public judgment. Cleared didn't mean forgiven. People wanted someone to blame, because the reality of losing Dale Earnhardt was too big, too painful, too unthinkable. And for some, pointing at Sterling made the grief easier to carry. Sterling admits that the backlash nearly drove him away from racing. He thought about retiring early, thought about walking away from the sport he loved, thought about living a quiet life somewhere far from cameras and crowds. But every time he considered it, he remembered Dale, the fierce competitor, the mentor, the friend. Dale wouldn't have quit. Dale wouldn't have let a tragedy take away the passion of racing. And Sterling knew deep down that leaving would only make the burden heavier. So he returned to the track, but the first race back was one of the darkest days of his life. The fans in the stands were split. Some cheered, some booed, and some stared with hollow eyes filled with unresolved grief. Sterling kept his head down, tightened his gloves, and climbed back into his car. His hands shook, his chest tightened. He had no idea if he was ready. Drive, he told himself. Just drive. And for the first time since the crash, he realized that driving was the only place where the noise went quiet, where the world made sense, and where he could forget, if only for a moment, the pain he carried off the track. But the healing journey was far from over. For more than 2 decades, Sterling Marlin carried a weight few could understand. Even as the world moved on from the tragic loss of Dale Earnhardt, Sterling's memory of that day never faded. At 67, he finally speaks openly, not just to clear the record, but to release a burden he's carried silently for 24 years. Sterling reflects on the long road from grief to acceptance. In the years immediately following the crash, he admits, he wrestled with guilt daily. Every race, every turn, every sudden movement on the track brought him back to that fateful lap. The question he asked himself most often, could I have done something differently? He replayed every second in his mind countless times. But with time, therapy, and the support of family, he began to understand what he hadn't realized then, that some events are beyond control, no matter how skilled or careful a driver is. He also reveals how NASCAR itself evolved in response to Dale's death. Safety measures were drastically improved, cars redesigned, helmets and restraints upgraded. While nothing could bring Dale back, Sterling took solace in knowing that the tragedy sparked changes that protected future generations of drivers. That understanding, he says, brought some healing, and a sense that the loss wasn't entirely in vain. Speaking out now is also part of Sterling's personal closure. He remembers decades of silence, avoiding interviews, declining opportunities to talk, and letting speculation build in the media. I couldn't, he says softly. It was too raw, too painful, too many emotions I wasn't ready to face. But now, with the perspective of age and distance, he feels ready to share his truth, the story of what happened, what he experienced emotionally, and how it shaped him both as a driver and as a person. Sterling also acknowledges the power of forgiveness, both giving and receiving it. He learned to forgive himself for circumstances he never could have prevented and accepted that he was not at fault. Likewise, he knows that the fans, grieving in their own way, deserve closure as well. By speaking publicly now, he hopes to bring understanding, peace, and honesty to everyone touched by that tragic day. Finally, Sterling reflects on Dale Earnhardt as more than a legend. He remembers him as a friend, a competitor, and an inspiration. His death was a turning point for NASCAR, yes, but also a reminder of the fragility of life and the preciousness of every moment on and off the track. Sterling's decision to share his experience is not about blame or fear, it's about truth, remembrance, and honoring the memory of someone who meant so much to the sport. As the closes, Sterling's message is clear. The crash changed everything, but it did not define him. It taught him about resilience, humility, and the enduring bonds forged in the heat of competition. And after 24 years, sharing this story finally allows Sterling Marlin to breathe, to heal, and to honor Dale Earnhardt the way he always wanted, truthfully, respectfully, and with a heart full of remembrance.